And I want you to follow along as we look at this, today's lesson, and I've been working on this lesson for most of the week. It's been something that has been weighing on my mind in my own life, and I thought, well, I would share it with you all this morning. Now, I thought about the straw that broke the camel's back. I think all of us heard that term, and it got me wondering, where did that term originate? The saying originated in 1677 as in a debate by Thomas Hobbes, and I can't remember the other fellow. But Thomas Hobbes is quoted as saying, "The last dictate of the judgment concerning the good or bad that may follow on any action is not properly the whole cause, but the last part of it, and yet may be said to produce the effect necessarily, in such manner as the last feather may be said to break a horse's back. When there were so many laid on before as their want, but that one to do it." In other words, what Thomas Hobbes is saying is, friends, life can heap up burdens on us that over time accumulate until finally we come to a point when it might very well be a little thing that causes us to break down. I think we've experienced, if you're a parent, you might go through an entire day of children who are screaming and yelling and running all over the place, and it's one little incident that finally makes you lose your mind and you begin to twitch. I think we've experienced similar things, sometimes with our work, sometimes within maybe our work lives. Sometimes we experience it in our spiritual lives, that we reach a point where we are burdened down with so much of a load that it brings us to our knees. Today I want to talk about avoiding getting to that point. People who are overburdened tend to be unhappy, unkind, I might even say snappy. We sometimes, when we're overburdened, it drains us of the energy that we need for happiness. It drains us of the energy that we need for kindness. Oftentimes, when we are overburdened, we simply don't have time for what should, mind you, what should be most important in our lives. I have said before, I'll say it again, by default, we do what is most important to us at any given time. You've chosen to be here this morning because there was nothing more important in your life than assembling together to worship God. And so you've come together to worship God because that was the most important thing in your life this morning. Here's the thing about a lot of these burdens. An awful lot of our own personal burdens and weight, and I'm speaking from experience, a lot of our own personal burdens are of our own making. I read a story, and I'll just give you the overview of this story. I wanted to print it out, and I didn't. I wanted to print it out and give it to you. It's a fictitious story about a man who met Jesus. Okay? I normally don't go for those kinds of stories. But I read a fictitious story about a man who met Jesus. And he said, "Lord, what can I do to help you?" And Jesus said, "I have a wagon with 3 stones in it. I would like for you to pull these stones down the path, up the mountain." He said, "Do not deviate from the path." And he drew a map for the man to follow. Sound familiar? As the man traveled along, he noticed some other stones. There were 3 stones in the wagon that Jesus asked him to pull. Not very big stones. As the man traveled along, he saw some more bigger, more beautiful stones, and he thought, oh, Jesus would love these stones. And he added them to his wagon. As he came to the edge of a village, he saw a sign, polished stones, 1/4 mile, with an arrow that pointed off the path. So the man thought, oh, Jesus will be so happy with polished stones. These might be the best ones he's ever seen. And so he goes the 1/4 mile down the path, and he gets the purchases with his own money some more beautiful polished stones. So his wagon is beginning to heap up. As he travels through the next community, he notices a bigger wagon for sale. He buys a bigger wagon and transfers all of the stones into the bigger wagon. And he begins to climb the mountain, realizing suddenly that it's so heavy to pull this wagon. And he begins to grumble. Why did Jesus ask me to do so much work for him? Sound familiar? He reaches the top of the mountain, and Jesus is there waiting, and the man is pouring sweat, and he's exhausted. He said, Jesus, why did you ask me to do so much? Jesus laid his hand on his shoulder and said, Son, I didn't ask for all of this. All I asked you to pull was a small wagon with 3 stones. And you have a large wagon heaping with stones. And Jesus took out the stones, all except for his original 3 stones, and said, all I asked of you was this. You see, we tend to do that ourselves. We heap on loads of stones onto our lives. And we tend to try to carry more than Jesus ever intended for us to carry on our own shoulders. Now, there are some burdens that the Lord has laid upon us. I want us to look at these burdens. Remember, Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So let's look at what God does require of us. There are burdens of the church. Look with me at the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11. And I would like to look at verse 28 through 30. Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11, beginning in verse 28. Jesus says, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Now, he says, I'll give you rest. Then he talks about a yoke. Now, we've talked in Bible class about what a yoke is. I really want to get one of these days so I can pull it up and say this is a yoke. But it's a wooden apparatus that fits on the necks of oxen that they pull with. You can pull a great load with a yoke. But Jesus says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest to your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. In truth, Jesus doesn't require a lot of us, even on a spiritual level. We've been working our way through the Old Testament, and we find all of the regulations, all of the feast days, all of the requirements that God laid upon his people under the Old Covenant. And we have very little of that. God doesn't require a lot from us. And what he does require is relatively simple. God requires for us, in order to inherit eternal life, that we accept salvation and that upon his terms. Matthew 28 and verse 18, actually begin in verse 18. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you, and behold, I'm with you always to the end of the age. Now, Mark would say, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. Okay? So we understand that salvation on Jesus' terms is necessary for us as Christians, and Jesus has laid that upon us. Not very difficult. We go through those steps of salvation at the close of every lesson. Something else that Jesus has laid upon us, and you'll notice this in our text here in Matthew chapter 28, that we are to teach others to observe all that he has commanded us. We are to teach everything regarding following Christ. Now again, that's not difficult. Everything that Jesus did and taught is recorded in 4 Gospels. And the other apostles built upon what was written in 4 basic Gospels. But look at what the Apostle Paul says in regardings of heaping on burdens upon individuals, regarding our faith and heaping upon ourselves even, more than God requires of us. Paul says, I have applied all these things to myself and to Apollos for your benefit, brothers, that you may learn by us not to, think back to our story for a moment, that you may learn by us not to go beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up in favor of one against another. It's so easy for us to add extra things into the church that we think are important or might be pleasing to God, but it's also important for us to realize that God doesn't want us to go beyond what is written, not adding to nor taking away from his word. And finally, John reminds us in Revelation 2 and verse 10 to be faithful unto death, and we will receive a crown of life. Very simple. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. We must remain faithful. Those are basic principles of the burdens of the church. We have to accept salvation, and that on God's terms. We have to follow the Bible to the best of our ability, neither adding to it nor diminishing from it. And we must remain faithful all the days of our lives. You know, the only other thing beyond that is to plant and plant and plant. In Ecclesiastes chapter 11 and verse 6, let's look at what the wise man said about planting. Ecclesiastes chapter 11 and in verse 6. The wise man Solomon said, in the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. You know the thing about planting? The longer you plant, the less seed you have to carry with you. I learned that very early on. Dad would send us out to the pasture field in March. It's called frost seeding. And he'd send us out with this apparatus that hung on your shoulder with a crank. And it had a little spinner underneath that spun the seed out. And we'd spin that, and we'd start out nice and fresh and brisk, and we'd be walking in the frosty air, spinning the seed out. Clover seed was usually what was in the cedar. And we'd spin that out on the field. But you know, the thing about it, the longer you walked, the lighter the cedar became. The less burden was there. So there's a principle that I'd like to make and apply to this. The more we sow, the easier our job becomes. Solomon reminds us to sow our seed at all times, not knowing what is going to prosper. Back in 1 Corinthians, again in chapter 3 this time, I'd like for us to look at verses 6 and 7 as the Apostle Paul talks about sowing seed. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and in verse 6. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 6, the Apostle Paul says, I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither is he who planted nor he who watered anything, but only God who gives the growth. Sometimes we think we've got to make it grow. Sometimes I look out over this congregation here and I think I have to make people grow. The truth is, I can't. All I can do is spread the seed. I can water it, but just like the seeds in the greenhouse, I can't make them grow. The secret to life in the seed is in the hands of God. Scientists, for all of the great advancements, have yet to be able to create life. We can create an environment, and we can sow and we can tend, but don't become so puffed up and elevated in your own mind to think that you can make someone else grow when they don't want to. It's an impossibility. I know from a preacher's perspective, sometimes you want someone to grow so bad. You want someone to become baptized. You want them to obtain salvation because you love them. You care about them. But at the end of the day, the decision is theirs, and it is not a burden that you or I have the ability to even bear. That is a burden that is placed upon the shoulders of individuals. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, and in verse 31 of that chapter, Jesus says this about the church. It is like a grain of mustard seed, which when sown on the ground is the smallest of all seeds on the earth. Yet when it is sown, it grows and becomes larger. And when the garden plants, puts out large branches so that the birds of the air can make nest in its shade. He's talking about the church. How God gives the growth. He says it's like a little teeny tiny seed. You put it in the ground. You sow it. God makes it grow. The church is like that. We can't make it grow. Only God can. So the burdens of the church are fairly simple. God does most of the work. There are burdens of the home, responsibilities, we might say, that we as both husbands and parents alike, husbands and wives, we have a burden of the home. And not to exclude you children, young people, you have a burden in the home as well. Look at what the Hebrew writer says back in Hebrews chapter 3 and in verse 4. Here the Hebrew writer writes a little piece that I think is applicable. Hebrews chapter 3 and in verse 4, the Hebrew writer says this: For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Friends, to function properly, the center of every Christian home must be Christ. Christ must be the center of our home. He must be what holds every fiber of our homes together. That takes a commitment both by parents, both a husband and a wife, and by the children in that home to make Christ the center of that home. Look with me at what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7 and in verse 25. Matthew chapter 7, verse 25. Because I'll tell you what, when we heap more upon our backs than what God puts on us, there very well may come a time when that feather or that straw might bring our homes, as it were, our camels, to its knees. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 25. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house. But it did not fall, because it was founded on the rock. Jesus is giving us a parable of a man who builds his house upon a rock. I'm going to read you the entire parable. When we get to that verse, focus on that verse. Then I'll continue reading, and I want you to focus on what happens to a home that is not founded upon Jesus Christ. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them, Jesus says, will be like a wise man who built his house on a rock. And the rains came, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rains fell, and the floods came, the winds blew, and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. Wow. Make sure, if our home is to survive, that it is founded upon Jesus Christ. When things go sideways in our lives, if our homes and our families are founded with Jesus Christ as the rock, that foundation, we will survive. Jesus doesn't say it's going to be easy. He doesn't say that there won't be trials. In fact, he says quite the opposite. The winds blew, the floods came, the rain fell. But if we're founded on Christ, we will survive. So the burden of the home is not difficult. It's not overwhelming. It's not more than we can handle. While we're in the Gospel of Matthew, turn over to Matthew chapter 12 and read verse 25 with me. Matthew chapter 12, verse 25. Jesus says, knowing their thoughts, he said to them, every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste. No city or house divided against itself will stand. Friends, in order to make a house work, a home work, both husband and wife must be committed to that relationship, and both husband and wife must be firmly founded upon Jesus Christ. This is something that may not exist in every home, and so therefore there may be more burdens upon us than what God intended for us to bear in the home. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, we find just one little section here on a burden that is upon parents in the home, and that is to teach the children. This can be difficult. Solomon says in the book of Proverbs, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. And those words are true and accurate if we do our jobs correctly. In Deuteronomy, we are given the recipe for how to do that, how to train up a child in the way he should go. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and in verse 7. Speaking of the laws of God, Moses says, you shall teach them diligently to your children. And then there comes the question, how shall we teach them diligently? Notice what Moses says. And you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up, all the time. We've got to live it. We've got to live it. You shall bind them as a sign on your hands, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. Ye shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. In other words, my friends, every opportunity that we have, every opportunity when we get up in the morning and when we go to bed at night, every opportunity should be filled with trying to teach our children how important God is to us. Look at what the psalmist says over in Psalms 112. Psalm 112, I'd just like to look briefly at verse 2. Psalm 112, his offspring will be mighty in the land. The generation of the upright will be blessed. His offspring. The one who puts God first in his life, that person's offspring will be blessed in the land. We don't have to provide our children with a lot of stuff. Children don't need a lot of stuff. We don't have to provide them with the biggest house or the best environment necessarily, as the world would see an environment. Paul reminds Timothy about godliness with contentment is great gain. Let's look back here and let's read this for sure. What the Apostle Paul writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and in verse 5. And constant friction among people who are deprived in mind and deprived of truth imagine that godliness is a means of gain. But godliness, Paul says, with contentment is great gain. You know, one of the things that I think our children catch on the most is when we are unsatisfied with our state in life. Our children sense dissatisfaction. And when we are dissatisfied, we tend to add to our burdens more than what God would have added. What God requires of us, what He asks of us to carry in the home is very simple. Our home must be founded on Christ with both the husband and wife committed. And secondly, we must teach our children to love and to honor and serve God. We don't have to provide a lot of extra stuff in order to do that. Life in the home can be very simple, and we can succeed very well. So unloading. Let's imagine with me, if you will, this morning. That's right, Lacey. It's a doghouse. Let's imagine with me, if you will, that you are like this donkey. That you are burdened down with all kinds of baggage. Cares, stresses of life. Let's ask ourselves the question of how we can unburden and unload some of those stresses in our lives. I recently switched chiropractors and I went to Dr. John, and Dr. John informed me of something that I knew and had forgotten. And that is that science tells us that our bodies need rest. Just like the overburdened pack animals need rest. We are pack animals in a lot of senses. Maybe you don't load up like this. Maybe your loads are mental and not physical loads. Let me share with you a secret that Dr. John shared with me. When we work, we make little microscopic tears in our muscles that only heal with rest. I mentioned earlier, I was talking to Scott Schofield, or Scotty as I used to know him, Saturday, and Scott shared with me that it's hard for me to imagine because he's kind of got Vernon and Dylan's kind of build, kind of that real thin, tall kind of nature. Scott says, yeah, I've been lifting weights, Tom, working out and building muscles. And I'm thinking, I don't know. Anyway, but I thought about that, and what happens when we lift weights and build muscles is that when we lift those weights, you notice sometimes your muscles are sore afterwards. That's from those little microscopic tears in your muscles. And in order for you to build muscle, after you work out, you have to allow those muscles a time of rest. And then you have to do the process all over again. But in order to rest, you have to lay the weights down. You have to take a moment for a period of time and unload. We have to do that with our burdens in life too. If we just keep continuing to tear our mental muscles, then we're going to reach a point where someone adds a straw or a feather to our back and we're going to collapse. And it may be of no fault of the straw or feather that causes us to collapse. Here's what I want you to do this week, and I'm going to try to do this as well myself. Make a list of your burdens. Mental burdens, physical burdens. Whatever it is that's weighing you down. Take that list, read it if necessary, but take that list to Jesus. Go to Him in prayer, go to God, and ask Him to help you to cut back on that list. I would encourage you to try to cut it in half. Maybe we can't cut it in half. Maybe we can only see our way to cutting it to back by a quarter of its size. But cut it back. Look at it with God. Ask for His guidance. Remember, Jesus says, "Come unto me, all you who are weak and heavy laden." God doesn't expect us to carry all those stones ourselves. Take it to Him and ask for His help and His assistance in cutting that back. Secondly, take just a bit of time to do absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's easier said than done. I understand that. Life is busy. We go 100 different directions. And we just can't take a minute for ourselves. But take a few minutes. Just a small amount of time, a block of time, and do absolutely nothing. Except for listen. Listen to what God is trying to communicate with you. You know, this is a Jesus principle. Even Jesus needed a vacation, a time alone, a time to commune with His Father. Look with me at the Gospel of Luke. If you don't believe me, look at this. It's really in there. Jesus was doing great things. He was healing thousands. And they were believing in Him. They were following Him. What does Jesus do? He disappears. He's like, okay guys, time out. I've got to have a break. Luke chapter 5. We find this in a couple of different passages in Luke's gospel alone. But Luke chapter 5 is perhaps the easiest one for us to turn to at the moment. Luke chapter 5, verse 16. But he would withdraw to desolate places to pray. The context, that's the very end of the paragraph. In that whole paragraph, it talks about everything wonderful and amazing that Jesus is doing. But Luke remembers as he looks back on this and he says, during this time period, when he's doing all of these great things, he would withdraw from the crowds. And he would spend that time in prayer with God. And I would like for you to do that this week as well. And I'm going to do it myself. Finally, I had a thought about a burden we lay upon ourselves that I wanted to share with you. That's a burden of perfection. We try, it's kind of our culture to a certain point, although I think we're losing this to some extent, but we try to be perfect. And in truth, we are not perfect people. We are not going to get everything accomplished. Some of you might be familiar with Mooney Warther. Now, Mr. Mooney Warther was a wood carver. He lived in Dover, Ohio. Now, I've been to the museum, the Warther Museum, a number of times. Mooney Warther was a world-renowned carver. In fact, the Smithsonian Institute wanted to buy his collection and move it to Washington, D.C., and Mr. Warther said no. If someone wants to see my work, they can come to Dover, Ohio, and see my work. Mr. Warther, in his old age, had a stroke when he was carving his last tray. And his son went to him and he said, "Dad, tell me what you want carved and I'll finish it for you." And his dad said, "No. Every human being leaves something on this earth unfinished. And I'm going to leave this tray unfinished." Mr. Warther died, and that train is still in the Warther Museum, and you can see it. The work of a great man left unfinished. Each one of us is going to leave something unfinished. Don't think that we're going to accomplish it all. While we're in the Gospel of Luke, let's look at Luke chapter 10 and in verse 41. Luke chapter 10, verse 41. Actually, begin in verse 40. Verse 38. Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her." Since we can't accomplish anything, let's choose the good portion. Let's learn from Jesus. When someone wants to learn a trade, they seek out an apprentice. They learn from one who has mastered the trade. And so we should learn from Jesus. I've got several passages. For some reason, all of the answers to these questions or thoughts came from the book of Philippians. So if you'll go there, Philippians chapter 2. The first thing that we learn from Jesus is to focus outward. Most of our burdens are added when we focus upon ourselves, and our focus is inward and what we want to accomplish and what we think others expect of us to accomplish. But in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 15, the Apostle Paul says, in verse 14, "Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom," notice, "you shine as lights in the world." No light ever shone within. All lights shine outward. The light bulbs we have in the auditorium this morning the glow permeates outward. Focus only on what is important. Philippians chapter 1, verse 9, the Apostle Paul says, "And it is my prayer that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and all discernment." In Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Think about these things. What you have learned and received and heard in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. And finally, back to Philippians chapter 2 and verse 14. Do all things without grumbling or disputing. Be cheerful in what God has given us to do. And finally, the closing verse is from 1 Peter chapter 2. You go there in your Bibles, 1 Peter chapter 2 and in verse 22. Peter writes, "Having purified your souls by obedience to the truth, for a sincere brotherly love, love one another earnestly from a pure heart, since you have been born again, not of perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and abiding Word of God. For all flesh is grass, and all its glory like the flower of the grass. The grass withers and the flower falls, but the word of the Lord remains forever." And this word is the good news that was preached to you. This word is good news that was preached to you. This morning, my friends, if you're overburdened, Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. If you're here this morning, you're not a child of God, you'll never unload. You'll never be able to be free. You'll never be able to unload all of your burdens, because only Jesus can take away the burden of sin. Only Jesus can help us begin again. If you're here today and you're subject to the invitation, I would encourage you to let us know.